December 10th marks Human Rights Day, and in light of this occasion, we delve into the issue of basic rights in society amid continued efforts to better contain COVID-19. For more, I have visiting Professor An Jun-sung from Yonsei University. Welcome back, Professor An.
Thank you.
I also have Dr. Sarah Davis at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies over in Geneva, live on the line. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Davis.
Thank you so much, Sunny.
We'll start here in the studio then. Professor An, let's begin with a few words on the challenges of ensuring a balance between pandemic-related measures and basic human rights.
Yeah, and well, about this very difficult question to answer, right?
It is.
Because that, like finding a middle ground is very difficult. Why is that the issue is really extremely polarized and then politicized issue all over the world, and it depends on the society or country, and you look at different perspectives, right? And then if the definition of human right is like a basic right which many society believe that all people should have. Well, by definition means that it depends on societal value and how society look at the pandemic situation or different middle ground. So I think that to get more something finding a middle ground is has to begin with the finding consensus on the society, how the society, each society will looking at the pandemic situation and how they would like to handle it together. I think that's the issue we talk about.
Right. And here's another difficult question. Is Korea doing well, that is, with regard to finding a middle ground between pandemic-related restrictions or measures and basic human rights?
Well, I think that in terms of the policy, right, I think that from the public policy perspective, and doing nothing, doing something is better than doing nothing, I think. So I think my concern is that sometimes some countries or even some Korean government sometimes get confusing, should we take this action or not? And I think that we should take more active action, so try to find it, because that we do not know what will happening, the COVID-19 situation, how we developed it from now on, because we thought it would be over by now.
By this time, yes, we did.
2 years, and now it's have a new variation comes out, and we have to get more booster shot, and we don't even know how many shots we needed in the future, right? So I guess that we need to try something new, but before we enforce it, any kind of policy, we should to educate the public, and then while we're handling the situation, what kind of difficult. I think that in terms of that, the government should be transparent, more transparent on what they're thinking and how we'll do it, and then try to educate the public also.
Right. So transparency and information will be moving in the right direction then.
Yeah.
Dr. Davis, I understand you've written quite extensively on the issue of human rights amid COVID-19. Do tell us a bit about your findings.
Thanks so much. I think with COVID-19, we've really seen how important it is to have public trust in institutions. And how do we win trust from others? It's in part through how we treat them, right? And so governments win trust by upholding basic principles, as Professor An has said, of transparency, non-discrimination, accountability, rule of law, and the public's right to have a voice in decision-making. And while, of course, we all live in different cultures and systems, we share these common principles through the United Nations and in international human rights laws that most countries have ratified. But unfortunately, with the COVID pandemic, and we've seen this before with other epidemics such as HIV, that in a crisis, some countries launch sweeping measures that really overreach and undermine human rights. And this can weaken public trust in the government and undermine public health in the long term. Human rights are not in opposition to public health. It's really part of how we all come together and begin to get out of the current crisis and build back better.
Right. Dr. Davis, is there a particular vulnerable group that you believe has been facing the brunt of pandemic-related hardships?
Yeah, there are many groups. I would say racialized and ethnic minorities, sex workers, people who use drugs, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people who are marginalized and discriminated against before the epidemic have really experienced even worse human rights abuses during it. But in particular, I would highlight the situation of migrants, because many migrants are what we call essential workers. They do healthcare, cleaning, delivery services, caring for children and the elderly. But according to the UN Migration Agency, migrants in many countries have faced obstacles to accessing healthcare, racism and discrimination. Many live in unsafe conditions with overcrowding and lack of access to clean water or sanitation, or are crowded in immigration centers or camps. And they're targeted for law enforcement for arrest or abuse, including extortion of bribes or worse. And in Singapore, just for example, in 2020, hundreds of migrants were locked up in dormitories where they had no protective equipment, and many people were just left to get sick with COVID. But we're all connected, right? If we don't address the health and human rights of those who are most marginalized, such as migrants, then we're all going to be vulnerable to the next pandemic.
Right. Professor Ann, migrant workers, something that Dr. Davis just mentioned, Seoul itself, officials here, they scrapped a COVID-19 testing mandate that was imposed on all foreign workers in the city amid rampant allegations of discrimination. First of all, is there a legal basis for such a mandate?
Well, I mean, of course, they have a legal basis for the, for the specific laws of National Health Code. But the problem is there's a bigger problem here. We're talking about when we talk about human rights and discrimination is we have to go back to the Korean Constitution, the fundamental rights. So basically, the Article 11 of the Korean Constitution, which is that all people are equal before the law, and no discrimination should be based on the gender or religion or any social status. So like social status, maybe it considered like foreign workers as well. It could be, but anyone physically in Korea, they can be considered as the social status. Even the foreigners can be looking at the constitutional issue. So if you look at this conflict of law situation, because that there's a constitutional law as protecting human rights and then preventing the discrimination based on social status. However, there's a quarantine law, right? Special laws in which we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic situation. So that's really things that we have to get the balance on it, which we should do it. And then about the Korean situation, the Korean National Human Rights Commission of Korea has made a recommendation. Actually, I looked it up. That's about last March. Actually, about 9 months ago, they released the recommendation. Say try to implement the non-discriminatory COVID-19 preventive measures to the local authority and the Korean governments. So that means that the Korean government has to take a look at into different additional perspectives about how you prevent any discriminatory measures against foreign workers or any other social status groups, right, in the Korean society. Because now Korea is become very complicated, very mixed, commingled and become like a melting pot now. Many foreign workers, and we need foreign workers together, and then there are a lot of foreign students also. So we have to deal with it, how we do it, and then the bottom line is that we try to avoid any kind of unnecessary discrimination. If we need some quarantine purposes, we try to minimize that kind of negative impact on the policies, quarantine implementations.
Right. Professor An, you mentioned the Constitution. Now, another issue of much contention here in the country, and also elsewhere, of course, is that related to vaccine verification. Having said that, Professor An, are COVID-19 vaccine passes constitutional?
Same question back and forth. Is it constitutional? Well, we have to. Well, it depends. Really. But one thing I can tell you that, right, that there's be a possible violation of the Constitution because that the Constitution really specifically saying that no discrimination based on social status, right? And it kind of distinguishing someone who vaccinated or not vaccinated, right? That's the issue. Also, the considering fact that the confirmed case number is really growing fast in Korea, and now we have maybe someday it's fast to count it, someone who got infected rather than vaccinated. So it's a very concerning issue here. So I guess that the constitutionality is that, well, there's a legal issue. Besides the legal issue about the constitution of the vaccine pass, you have to look at the issue, current issue. Actually, recently my son, like a 12-year-old kid, asked me, should I get vaccinated? It's a big issue, right? And then I say, well, and he said, he got scared about side effect. Some people died about side effect. We don't even know what will have impact on the children, on the age, So it's a very concern. I told him, well, if you want to go overseas, travel, maybe you got vaccinated for sure because they're not gonna accept you to get in there. But if you stay in Korea, well, we'll wait and see, what will happen and how the government will, come up with some, solutions how to, the alternatives, right? So, but still, it's a very tough question, and especially we talking about many European countries would, have been implementing the vaccination for teenagers aged like 12 to 17, I think. Yeah, and then now they kind of allowing the vaccination for the kids aged 5 to 11, but still in Korean perspective, now we're discussing about we should get vaccinated, the teenagers, or make it mandatory. That's the issue. Also, other thing happened actually. My son I made a reservation for the movie 2 weeks later. Actually, 2 weeks ago, I made it reservation, and he want to really watch it with friends. But however, now it's a vaccinate, we have a vaccinate pass, right? So if the government mandated, or even the teenager should get vaccinated, should get a vaccine pass, means that the teenager cannot go to the movie theater, even library, cafe or restaurant without vaccine pass. There's a lot of, hassle, and there's a lot of limitation on the fundamental right. Plus that, well, that's a tough course, right? So I guess that's one. I think the French case that many European countries, even though they implementing vaccine pass policy, they have exception for education. So, if you go to school, you don't need a vaccine pass because they concern about the education divide, like a social divide issues. But in Korea, we have some issue about here, very similar issue about when you go to institution, right?
Right, so schools, you don't need
require,
to have a vaccine
but no school,
pass,
no
but
vaccine.
For hagwons,
But hagwon, right?
schools.
Institutions, private institutions, you have to get it. So there was some debate on it, and
which is why parents are quite, a number of parents are quite upset.
Yeah.
Right, it is an ongoing debate here. Meanwhile, Dr. Davis, back in Switzerland, Swiss voters late last month backed a law for COVID-19 vaccine certificates. First, do tell us a bit about these certificates.
Yeah, well, they're basically, I'm sure, similar to what you might have emerging in Korea, which is it's something that's on your phone and something that you can scan the QR code in order to get access to public spaces. I have to say, just in terms of the situation in Switzerland, I'm from the US originally, and I've lived in Switzerland for 9 years. And when I compare the situation here with my family in the US and the UK and friends in Africa, I really feel fortunate to live in a country with very strong health systems and human rights protections. Because while cases are on the rise and there are many concerns about Omicron, but I feel like the Swiss government has really tried very hard in rolling out the vaccine pass and in other measures to be transparent, to keep the restrictions to the bare minimum, and to really encourage people as adults to make evidence-based choices. So while the COVID pass is required, and now even also for the university where I work, to gain access to public spaces such as restaurants and other gatherings, people who are not vaccinated can also test, and so that's also an option for people. And there were protests here in Switzerland against the COVID-19 law, which put the vaccine pass into place last month. But Switzerland is a federal democracy, and that was in part because people really treasure the decentralization of decision-making here. They don't like to see the federal council exercising a lot of power. And some people have feared that with COVID, that there's been this increase in government overreach and increase in seeking authority. And Swiss people really like their privacy, and they really don't like to have their phones monitored. So today, most people accept the pass, but I think it's in part because, you have to have it to get into movie theaters as well, but also because they understand that their privacy is protected and data protection is quite strong here.
Right, and staying with that, Dr. Davis, some 2/3 of the voters reportedly favoured this law. So would it be reasonable to assume that most members of the public there support the need for vaccine verifications?
Yes, and I think that's really based on the evidence that's increasingly now coming to light, which is that millions of people have been vaccinated, and it's clear that it does reduce serious illness and keep you safe. And we'll see what happens with the new variants that are coming out, but it certainly seems to be safer to be vaccinated than unvaccinated.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor An, moving beyond vaccine verifications, what do you suppose has been the impact of lockdowns on human rights issues?
Well, that's a very extreme case, right? But I think that's one of the things that really differentiate from Korean policy and the European policy, right? The European, many countries have shut down actually, and then some cities in the US have shut down, right? And you see the riot there. Actually, I was talking to one of my students yesterday after final exam, and she told me, "Oh, by the way, I just got the news, and Korea will shut down for the COVID-19." I was like, "No way," And then she said, "Oh, yeah, I thought it was a German, not in Korea." I was like, if they shut down, then there was a riot in the street. That's like European countries, right? Because really extreme, I think that's the very extreme measure to taking, and then getting a balance, it's perfect balance, it's very difficult, but not even perfect balance, right? Proper balance, I guess, reasonable balance, I guess that's the things we needed. Well, as we discussed it today, the problem is that we don't know about what will happen in COVID-19, and we do not know what we're doing will be there somewhere in 2 years, right? So what we do know is that for sure that maybe getting vaccinated is maybe safer, I think perhaps safer scientifically than not vaccinated. So I think things will get safer and a more conservative approach on how we're dealing with the current situation, right? Yeah, and then company shutdown, actually, there's kind of a concerns against it, and then still, still without the complete shutdown, and the small business in Korea having really suffering, very difficult to pay high rent, and there might a lot of people are going out of business. I see that you mean tteokbokki, right, store next door, they're closing down because they couldn't afford their food. I mean, even the small store, I see they're closing in my neighborhood. That's really bad, sad story, right? So you mean complete shutdown, but I think that it depends on how you see it. Complete shutdown means shorter term, right? More impact, higher impact in the short term. But the way I think that I kind of personally agree on the way on the gradual, step by step. But still, in any case, there's a pro and cons, right? So you have to see that both sides.
Right. Dr. Davis, I believe you've also covered the link between national lockdowns and violations of basic human rights. Do you care to elaborate?
Yeah, I think the lockdown issue is very complicated because, of course, it does help to reduce transmission, but the impact is quite severe, as Professor An has highlighted. And we've seen, especially, for many of us, when there's a lockdown, we get to work from home, and maybe we have to do more Zoom calls with our friends and family. But for many people who are working in the informal sector, for marginalized groups, for people with chronic illnesses, lockdowns can be quite disastrous. It means they no longer have income. It's quite difficult to move around. They're subject to arrest or harassment by the police. And so when planning a lockdown, I think it's very important that governments have financial aid in place, mental health care and other forms of support to try to mitigate some of the harm that can happen.
Right. Dr. Davis, we touched upon this briefly a little at the start of our segment, of course, but now the question is, how do you explain the sad phenomenon of the vulnerable in society bearing the brunt of the pandemic?
I think it is really unfortunate, but we've seen before with HIV, for example, that human rights violations help to cause pandemics in a way, and also that they can then follow on epidemics. I mean, if we go back to the beginning of COVID-19, we can remember that it was actually censorship that actually suppressed information from coming out in the first place from China, and that helped to turn a local outbreak into something that was spreading among many countries and slowed the global response. But then as the pandemic spread, we saw that many countries had failed to invest in health systems. So the US and the UK really, years of failure to invest in their health systems meant that they really struggled to respond, while countries like Korea that had made that investment actually did quite well in the beginning of the pandemic. But then these lockdowns have had really devastating impacts on elderly people, people in poverty, and vulnerable groups who struggle without jobs or financial aid. So it's really been a tough couple of years for human rights for many people.
Right, and staying with that, Professor An, those who have recovered from COVID-19 are in some cases exposed to discrimination within their communities now. What can you tell us about the legal framework, perhaps, to better protect the interests of those who had been infected with COVID-19 but have since recovered?
Well, just a very interesting question. Actually, it depends on the timing frame when you ask a question, same question. If you ask me 6 months ago, maybe, oh yeah, we should get more legal protection. But nowadays, I see that this semester, I had 3 or 4 cases from my class got infected. And last semester, 1 student, right? And I see that, so it's very serious things happens. So if as the number of the confirmed cases is growing very fast. It's like maybe now we have over 7,000 per day, and maybe heading to maybe 1,000 per day. That's very scary story, because I was talking with my friends in Singapore, and they talk about the issue in Singapore situation. They had a 5,000 case per day, and considering their kind of population size of 5 million, right? That's about 1,000 days, less than 3 years. So less than 3 years, if you're using keeping the current, the speed, right? They will everybody get infected. So now Korea is facing very similar situation, maybe heading to 10,000 per day, and it could be more per day. So it means that you have to face it that we have to realize something different situation. It's like, do I have to get some legal protection for the people got infected? Well, maybe you need to get some other support, because that legal procedure legal measure takes time. You could go to the National Assembly, to go to the presidential office sometimes, and go to the ministerial ordinance, right? So I guess now we have to know more like how you deal with the situation, different perspective. They could take a proactive action rather than retroactive. It's like, I guess it's not the time to ask how you protect it, people get infected. It's like how you protect or how to minimize some side effect of the social issues.
Right, a valid point, of course. All right, Professor An, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you.
And Dr. Davis over in Switzerland, thank you very much for your time and your insights at this very early hour.